Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, but yeah, look, it's great to be here in Manila, and as I was saying, it's great to see just such a good turnout for data storytelling, right? So I'm sure there's a lot of people here that work with data in their day-to-day roles and are thinking, how can I unlock those stories that are hidden within my data? Hopefully this 1 hour seminar will go some way to closing that gap. I have to give some acknowledgements before I proceed here. This presentation was not just created by me. It was the result of the work of some of the DataSeer team as well. So I want to give acknowledgement to Ching over here, who's a data scientist but doubling as a photographer tonight. You know, data scientists have many, many skills. You've seen they know computer science, programming, stats, and they also know photography. So for those of you who've seen the data science Venn diagram, you know, the three things, I'm going to add photography as a fourth thing there. You know, also Jose, our graphic designer, he's working the video camera, and I think Josh is here as well. So this presentation, a lot of what you see here was the result of the hard work of the DataSeer team, homegrown Philippine team doing data science and analytics for clients all around the world. So well done to them. Okay, let's get into it. Let's provide some context first as to, you know, this is Data Science Philippines. We're all interested in data science. Where does data storytelling fit in terms of data science and analytics? Okay, many of you here would have seen this sort of chart before, the analytics value chain. So a lot of consultancies out there, like IBM and you know, Tata Consulting, I've seen them produce this chart. A lot of consultancies produce this chart as an example of the journey that businesses should go through as they progress in their analytics journey. So the idea is that you have to start down here, get your data management sorted out, organize your data. And this goes for any company, whether it's the biggest telco in the country or a restaurant in the fort, right? You've got to figure out your data collection and data storage first, data management first. Once you've figured that out, then you can query that database or that Excel sheet or whatever it is that's storing your data. You can query it and produce routine reports. So, yes?
So sorry to interrupt.
That's all right.
Is it okay to take pictures of your slides?
Yeah, sure, yeah. I'm actually going to share the slides on the Meetup discussion forum, which has been very lively. It was good to see. Yeah, so I'm going to share these slides as a PDF there. So, you know, if you feel like it's going too fast, you're missing things. I'm getting a bit of static there. If you feel like you're missing things, then yeah, you can download the whole thing there. Okay, so reporting, that's the next step. So weekly reports, quarterly reports, monthly reports, the routine reports, that's touted to be the next stage after you've organized your data. After your routine reports, then it's descriptive analytics. So these are insights that aren't contained in your routine reports. Okay, so I used to do some consulting work for a big supermarket in Australia. They had routine monthly reports, but sometimes the executives say, actually, I really want to know for Mother's Day, should we run that same campaign that we ran last year? And that's not in the routine report. So you have to dive into the data and actually answer that specific question and produce tables and visualizations that answer that specific question. But you can't do that until your data management is sorted out, right? So this is a progression here. Moving on to predictive analytics and machine learning, this is supposedly the next level of sophistication with higher levels of value, according to this chart. So to relate this back to the real world, you know, every time you log into Facebook, you are suggested friends that you can add. Okay, that's the result of a multinomial classification model that Facebook has built that's continuously retraining and figuring out who are the top like 3 or 4 people to recommend to you who'll have the most likelihood that you're going to add them as a friend. Because the more friends you add, the deeper you're stuck in the network, right? So this is the idea that it's a value chain, and there's higher levels of value. The y-axis is business value. If you Google the analytics value chain, you'll see this all over Google, and a lot of our analytics practitioners live by this chart. And I'm here to say that I don't think this chart is accurate. I actually, based on the client work that I do and that DataSeer does, And from what I saw in my previous roles, most of the value, 60-70% of the value, is Dan Meyer here? I'd love to get the thoughts of another thought leader here, just to see whether they agree. But in my opinion, 60-70% of the value is from the reporting and the descriptive analytics. Having a fast data warehouse and a team in place that can answer the specific questions that senior management have of the data set and turning those insights around quickly, like within 24 hours, and in a way that the story is consumable by the upper management. In my opinion, that's the majority of the value. A lot of consulting firms overhype the predictive analytics and the machine learning. I'm not here to say that they're not high value. Of course, there's massive value in machine learning and predictive analytics. But what I'm saying is this chart is kind of BS, okay? And I don't think that, a lot of analysts that don't know the machine learning, they feel like, oh, I'm not providing as much value as the data scientist that does the fancy machine learning. I don't think that's true at all. I think if you produce great data stories, then you're really contributing a lot to the bottom line of the firm. Anyway, I'm ranting. Let's move on. So data storytelling fits into here. Okay, it's these two. It's the reporting and the descriptive analytics. Data storytelling is about doing those two things better for a company. There's 4 keys to data storytelling, in my opinion. We're going to cover each of these in turn, starting with the audience. Okay. The audience is the hero of your data story. Everything you do in your activities to come up with your data story should be audience-centric and centered around the audience. How many people with a stats background do we have in the room? Whole bunch, right? And then math, a few math, I guess. Yeah, so a few math. So one thing I'd just say right at the start here is that statisticians and mathematicians often, when they produce their data stories, they often get too technical. And I think it's the result of them being, in my opinion, and I'm an ex-statistician, so I know where this is coming from. It comes from insecurity. Okay, statisticians have been through years and years of study, learning central limit theorem to inferential statistics, all of this, and the bottom line is they don't get to use those skills to show management what they can do, right? And so what happens is when they go and tell their data stories, they start using fancy measures and fancy terms. Like, oh, the standard deviation is this and the p-value is this. And let me tell you, if you ask a statistician, what is a standard deviation? I would hope, well, actually, I know from our interview process at DataSeer, not everyone gets this, even with a stats background, but I would hope that 90 out of 100 statisticians will be able to clearly give you a definition of a standard deviation. But if you ask the top 100 CEOs in the Philippines, what is a standard deviation? I would guess maybe 3 or 4 out of 100 would be able to give you a fairly rigorous definition of what that is. Okay, so that means you have to look at who is your audience, what metrics and what story and what visuals are they ready to consume? Because if they're not ready to consume your story, you're going to be over here. You're going to be over here, no learning and fragmented learning. So you're off there presenting your standard deviation, your skewness and your kurtosis, and they're just thinking, I'm lost here. Okay? So step 0, who is the audience? Let's choose the right metrics for that audience. We also want to think of the most appropriate medium for that audience. So 15 years ago, data stories typically took the form of a PowerPoint deck. A lot of managers, that's still what they want to see. It's still fairly effective medium for telling data stories. Although I have a colleague that says that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I think it's a decent medium, right? But just know that you've got other ways of telling stories now. You've got Tableau dashboards in the cloud. You've got interactive D3 visualizations with animation and drill down. Your executive might not want a static PowerPoint deck. They might want an interactive thing that they can view on their iPad on a Sunday morning, right? So think carefully about what medium. Okay, but the most important thing when talking about audience for data stories is focusing your presentation around a key, what I call big takeaway, that your stakeholders can take away, right? I see this all the time. We do a lot of private training with companies all around the world. And one thing I see, especially for companies with large data sets, is they spend a lot of time doing exploratory data analysis. You know, so they've got 100, 200, 300 variables at their disposal, millions of rows, and the data scientists and analysts do some great work diving in and understanding what are the interesting things in this data. And because they've spent all this time digging out these nuggets of insight, they want to kind of present them all. When that's a really big mistake, because you know, maybe all of them aren't going to be useful to the executive that you're presenting to. So you've got to put on the hat of that executive and say, what is their role? What do they have the ability to change? And what is the big takeaway that they need out of this data set? At most, 1 or 2 big takeaways. We're going to go through an example of this. Okay, so the example we're going to go through, we're assuming that we are consultants, all of us. It's a brand new consulting firm in the Philippines, and we're all a part of it. And we're consultants, and we've been brought in to look at some airline data. And we're going to be presenting to the chief operating officer of the airline. And the chief operating officer wants a recommendation as to whether they should add additional flights to a specific route that the airline services, and that route is the Sydney to LA route. So let's look at the data, and let's start this process of telling a story with data. I've just got it in Excel format. First thing I notice is we've got 3 variables. We've got time, we've got seats occupied, and we've got seats available. The very first question to ask is, do we even need a visualization? Okay, I've seen some pretty hilarious bar charts where it might be, you know, what proportion of people voted for Trump? Okay, and they've got proportion that voted for Trump, and then proportion that voted for Hillary, right? As just a binary thing. You don't need a chart for that. You just report your headline metric in a big number. This, though, 3 variables, you know, how many rows? Like something like 11, 12 rows or something like that. That's enough data to justify visualization. So tick, let's move on with visualization. Now, there's a lot of bad data stories out there. Terrible, ugly data stories. And I blame one person for this, Bill Gates. What most people do is they have their data here in Excel and they highlight it and then just go insert and just kind of like, I don't know, like through telekinesis, just kind of like pick something, right? And then they randomly choose different charts until they go, yeah, that looks okay. And then they go with that. Okay, this is not a framework for telling good stories with data. We can't fit it into this session, but what we want is a framework for deciding, okay, here's my data, here's what I need my stakeholders to know. What is the right chart to close that gap, right? But as a first step, what we recommend at Dataseer is to produce what we call an exploratory chart. So an exploratory chart is, yes, you do that thing. You just go insert and just do the first thing. So that's what I did here. And I've inserted a clustered bar chart. And so now we can see, and I've formatted this a little bit, just because the default Excel graphs are just rubbish. And so we've got a clustered bar chart here. And the first thing we want to do is say, well, what are the interesting insights in this data? Okay, as analysts and data scientists, it's all about delivering value, delivering insights. So we notice a few things. Seats available has increased pretty much every year. That's the green series. And every time we've increased the number of seats available, demand, or seats occupied, has risen to fill those extra seats. Okay? So there could be some leftover demand that we're not servicing, right? That's one takeaway. Demand is seasonal. Notice that every Q4, seats occupied spikes. Okay, so every Q4, seats occupied does go up. Notice in 2014, I think someone intelligent was in charge, because in 2014, they increased the number of seats available for Q4, predicting that spike. And actually, the number of seats occupied rose to fill that demand. But notice in 2015, they didn't do that. They didn't increase capacity in Q4. In 2016, they didn't do that either. So I'm starting to think, well, maybe, what position are we going to be in 2017 if we don't add seats? I'm starting to think we might not be in a good position. Okay, so if I'm going to come up with a big takeaway here, this is not a sophisticated analysis, just for an example. The big takeaway is that we need additional seats in late 2017, right? And based on our historical data, the way demand has been increasing to fill additional seats, we're going to make more money because we're going to move more seats. Okay, so that's the big takeaway. So let's design a data story around that big takeaway. Okay, so we've covered the audience. The next step, which I'm not really going to cover in this presentation, is data prep. Now, obviously, those of you who work with commercial data know that your commercial data sets look nothing like this, right? They're sitting in a big data warehouse. There's, we were working with a client the other day. In 2012, they changed to a different data warehouse. They literally lost 6 months of data in the changeover. So there's like a huge data break. Commercial data, it's full of outliers, it's full of blanks, it's full of, all sorts of problems. So data is the fuel that goes into your data story. Okay, garbage in, garbage out. So if you put bad data into your data story, you're literally reporting on garbage. So that's the next step. We teach it in our full 2-day course, how to pre-process the data to make sure it's ready for telling a story with data. We don't have time to cover it in this session. Okay. Okay, but assuming you've done all that pre-processing and cleaning, what's the next step? The next step, assuming a visualization is appropriate, okay, and it may be a table is more appropriate or a single metric is more appropriate, but assuming visualization is more appropriate, that's the next step here. And this is the bit that gets me excited. Okay, so statisticians, data scientists, we have very boring lives. We get excited by data visualization. Okay, so let's talk about good data visualization. First thing, number one principle, above all else, show the data. Okay, this is a quote from Edward Tufte, who is widely considered to be the godfather of modern data visualization theory. This is the guy who, in around the 1970s, almost single-handedly made data visualization its own sub-branch of statistics with its own academic journals and its own empirical research, and brought data visualization up in the academic community to be a field worthy of scientific study. And he came up with lots of research papers and lots of books. And his number one principle is, above all else, show the data, which sounds trivial. We might think, yeah, I show the data. I do my Excel charts, I show it. But in actual fact, a lot of us don't. Here's a chart that I saw on a TV screen when I was in Silicon Valley a couple of months ago. And so I'm sitting in the airport and I'm watching the screen and I'm looking at this thing and I'm thinking, I felt like my IQ went down 25 points just by looking at this thing. So this is a chart. If your shapes are not going to correspond to your numbers, then don't bother with shapes, right? This is not showing the data. Okay, that was on air. That was live, right? Okay. Has anyone seen this before? Okay, this was going viral on Facebook a couple of months ago. CNN Philippines released this. I hope there's no one from CNN Philippines in the room. So, top causes of stress for Filipinos. Apparently, let's see if I can just zoom in for the people at the back. No, it's not going to work. Okay. Big problem. The slices don't sum to 100%. So we're not showing the data. We're actually hiding like the missing category. Right? And there's all sorts of problems with pie charts, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So that's not showing the data. Okay. Actually, I will talk about the problems with pie charts. Okay. Let's have a bit of a poll here. Let's collect some data. Who votes that item C is bigger than item A? Not a single vote. Okay, who votes that item A is between 1 and 1.25 times bigger than item C? Any votes? Yeah, there's a vote there. A few votes. Okay, who votes that item A is between 1.25 and 1.75 times bigger than item C? Okay, thank you for voting. And then who votes that item A is more than 1.75 times bigger? Okay, we've got a problem with data collection. You know, a lot of people didn't respond. But anyway, even before I go to this next slide, we've proven that this is an ineffective visualization because we're disagreeing with the actual magnitude. A good visualization, if that was in a 2D bar chart, do you think we're going to be disagreeing? No, we're going to say, oh, it's about 1.5, 1.8 times bigger, right? So let's actually look at the real data. So we see that item A is more than double as big as item C. Okay, so we want to avoid, in general, I'll explain in a moment why we want to avoid pie charts, even 2D. I'll explain that in a moment, but we want to avoid 2D pie charts. We especially want to avoid 3D pie charts. And I was about to say something inappropriate, but we never want to be using exploding 3D pie charts, ever. Right? They're simply an abomination. Okay, so now why? Okay, it's because 3D and tilt changes the perspective. Okay, and then we can't make comparisons anymore. It misleads. Okay, so we've got to resist 3D. That's not really a pie chart. That's more a wedding cake, actually. Okay. So anyway, Edward Tufte. Okay, you think this bothers me, right? You've got to read Edward Tufte's book, right? It's like a Bible, and like a quarter of it's dedicated to just destroying pie charts. And so he came up, he declared war on pie charts and bad visualizations. And when a statistician declares war on something, what do? They invent a formula. And so Edward Tufte's formula is known as the data to ink ratio. It is the amount of ink in your chart that's devoted to showing the data, right, which is the special ink, the important ink, divided by the total ink that was used to make the graphic. Okay, so here, all this ink on the side, like that wall on the side, like we don't need that. It doesn't show anything. Like that, how come that slice gets a wall and the other slice doesn't get a wall? Here's another one. Okay. There's so much ink on this chart that's unnecessary. The vertical grid lines, they've got to go. Okay, why does the background need to be blue? Every additional element of ink that you put on your chart is distracting the viewer from the core data story. Okay, here's the exact same data with the chart junk removed. Okay, this has a data ink ratio of like almost 100%. Okay, so the data ink ratio, it's never something you actually calculate, right? So don't go back to your office and calculate the data ink ratio of your charts. But it's more a heuristic for thinking about your visuals. Okay, so that's the first principle of data visuals. Have a good data to ink ratio. just to drive the point home, here's another chart. You might think, oh, okay, 3D pie charts are bad, but maybe 3D bar is okay. Okay, and I know some of you think it's okay because when we consult to companies here and in other countries as well, I've been walking down like corridors of BPOs and I see, they've got their metrics up in the corridors and I see these 3D charts everywhere. I can't escape them. So here, okay, how many females are earning $25,000 or more? So I'm going to follow my bar. I'm going to say, okay, maybe 680, 690, right? According to that visualization. I go here, oh, it turns out exactly 700. Okay, so, absolutely useless visualization, the 3D chart. So 3D is dead. Let's have a moment of silence. It's all over. Okay. All right. Another, okay, good visualization design is actually a full 2-day course, right? DataSeer, we have a 2-day course in DataViz. I'm just cherry picking a few tips that you guys can take home with you today. The next thing I'm going to talk about is something called the Gestalt laws of visual perception. These were discovered by a group of German psychologists back in the 1920s. They noticed a few things about how humans perceive the world. And these principles have stood the test of time and are still widely taught in psych classes. As any of you have taken psych, you probably saw these already. So what are the Gestalt laws of visual perception? We've got 8 laws here. I'm just going to cover a few of these that can help you do better visualizations. And the first I'm going to talk about is proximity. So in this group of dots on the left, what do we see here? Do we see rows or columns? Hand up if you see columns. Okay. Okay, in that group. So some people seeing columns. Hands up if you see rows. Very interesting. And actually, those of you who see columns, I've run this exercise a few times. I did this talk in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago. There was a few people that saw columns. You guys are outliers, all right? But it's genuinely, some people genuinely see columns. It's a different way of perceiving the world. And the Gestalt researchers actually really looked at that. But most people see rows there. Why? Because of the proximity of the dots to each other. And then in group B, people tend to see columns instead of rows. In group C, people tend to see 2 groups of dots rather than one contiguous blob of dots. Okay, that's the first law I'm going to talk about. We're going to see how it applies to visualization in a moment. The next law is the law of similarity. Okay, hands up if you see columns in group A. None. Okay, hands up if you see rows. Yeah, everyone else. Okay, so similarity, that was a stronger rule. No one was, on the other side there. So let's apply both of these rules to our visualizations. What I've done here is I've taken our seats occupied and seats available chart. And the first thing I've done is I've gone from a clustered bar chart. So we were starting with this. We were starting with this. And I've switched from clustered bar chart to a line chart. And the reason for that is I want to show the gap between the 2 series. I'm not so concerned with the magnitude for this particular story. Maybe for a different story I'm concerned with the magnitude. But for this story, I want to show them that, hey, we are right, we're at max here. Okay, that gap has closed. So I've gone to a line chart instead of a clustered bar. Now, those of you who use Excel, which is probably all of us, you'll notice that this is what your default Excel 2013 chart looks like. I won't go into why it's terrible, but the one thing I will talk about is the legend goes down the bottom. And Excel gives you the luxury of putting your legend on the bottom, on the top, or on the side. Okay? Let's use the Gestalt principle of proximity and similarity to do a better legend. So here's the exact same data. Similarity of color means the brain says that label goes with that line and that label goes with that line, and then the proximity also ties them together. Okay? So applying those Gestalt laws. Okay? Now, that's an improved chart. Okay? But this is not a data story yet. Right? This is still just a chart. Okay? So we still have some work to do. Okay. I'll just go through one bonus law, which is the enclosure Gestalt law. So on the left here, we tend to see these 5 circles. We tend to see these 5 circles over here as being together, and the other circles as being not with those. Same here, we tend to see the ones in this translucent egg as being together, because they're enclosed. Okay, so you can enclose with a box, you can enclose with a translucent shading in PowerPoint or Excel. Okay, so how can we use enclosure to tell a better story? I turn to Robert De Niro. Okay, so this is real data. And it appears well, I haven't got it here, but the person who originally tweeted this visualization, their caption was, you can tell the exact year that Robert De Niro gave up. Okay? And enclosure works especially well for scatter plots. With scatter plots, you have a very high volume of data. Okay? With bubble charts, even higher volume because you've got the third dimension on there. Enclosure works really well to take a large scatter plot and simplify the story for the viewer. So enclosure is used here to say, okay, over here blue, we associate blue with good. This is the glory years of Robert De Niro. And then he turned 59 and then bam, like it's all over. Okay? So using 2 rectangular boxes there, we can enclose in different ways. So what I'm going to show now is the same data. Now we've gone with the translucent diagonal enclosure. So now we're not trying to say, like the previous chart was trying to show he was really, really good, and then 59, bam, he's bad. Okay, this is trying to show that, you know, he started aging and, you know, he just gradually got worse over time, right? So notice that we can focus the story by using these Gestalt principles of perception, right? This is really the art of data storytelling. Okay, so blank scatter plots with your XY graph and just the data. We don't want to see that anymore. Think about enclosure, think about quadrants, and think about what the big takeaway. What do you want your audience to know? How are you going to show that with the Gestalt principles? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so we've covered the audience. I talked a little bit about data, but we don't have time to cover it here. And I cherry-picked a few interesting things about visualization. There's a lot more. We don't have time today. Let's now talk about, this is really what separates your good analysts and data scientists from, you know, just your standard ones. And that's adding the narrative for decision makers. I turn to a great example from Cole Nussbaumer. She's an ex-Googler, and she has a great book on data storytelling called Storytelling with Data. I've got the reference down the bottom. I recommend you buy it. And I've got an excellent example here from her. So again, she's got a clustered bar chart. And this is IT help desk data. So every month, we have the Every month we have the number of tickets received, that's in blue, and the number of tickets processed. Okay, so obviously an IT support desk wants to be keeping up with demand, and we see that they are keeping up with the demand until about June, and then they're falling behind. Okay, and August was especially bad. They received 202 support tickets. They only serviced 156. Okay, so that's the story here. Something's happened here. Something's happened around here, and since then they've never caught up with demand. So that's what our exploratory chart has revealed. Let's add the narrative to this story. Exact same data. She's gone for the line chart instead of the clustered bar because we're looking at the gap. She's using the Gestalt principles of proximity and similarity here for her legend. But the key is the insight. And what she's done is she's dug down and said, actually, why are we seeing this? What's happened? And 2 employees quit in May. Get that onto your chart. Okay, now your chart is a living, breathing thing with strategy for management. And not only is she giving a root cause reason as to why this has happened, she's moving up the value chain. She's not just, this chart is not produced by some drone analyst that just churns out, charts. She's moving up to strategy. And she's saying, actually, you know what, based on our analysis of the data, you need to hire 2 more full-time people. And so an executive that sees this story says, okay, that's what they want me to do. There's the data to back it up. Yeah, okay. Right? So this is now data storytelling nirvana. Another example from Cole. What we have here is a before and after pie chart. Edward Tufte has a quote on pie charts. He said, "The only thing worse than a pie chart is several of them." and they actually, and he has data to back up where that quote comes from. They perform really, really badly, and in empirical research, which I'll talk about in a moment, they perform really badly in comparisons, right? Like, you never want to have a time series of pie charts, right? Okay, I've seen it. Like, I should have saved it. All right, anyway, so what we have here is a bunch of kiddies were asked, how do you feel about doing science? They're probably millennials or something. They're not that excited and all of that. And then they did some intervention. Okay, they did an intervention that was, going to get them excited about science, right? And then here is the after measures. Okay. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this an effective visualization? Any ideas out there? How can we improve on this thing as a one-page story? And I understand it takes courage because there's a lot of people here. But is there anyone that might have an idea on at least an idea of a visual that might work a bit better? Yeah, some form of line chart, exactly, thank you. Some form of line chart would work a lot better here. Now, why is that? I'll show the chart in a sec, but I'll explain why first. So Cleveland and McGill in 1984 did some really interesting research on how we perceive relative differences depending on how that difference was framed. Now, when it comes to length, differences in length, like in a bar chart, we do very, very well at comparing relative differences in length. So these experiments were sort of like this. You get a bunch of people, you get like 100 sample size of 100 people, you show them 2 bars next to each other, or 2 lines next to each other, and you say, how much bigger is this line than this line? And then you average out their results and then see how close they were to reality. Okay. So they did that with lines. They did it with position, like the position of dots. They did it with angles. Which angle is bigger? Like how much bigger is this angle than that angle? And they did it with areas And there's been research done on comparing relative slice sizes, okay? And the research found that we do really, really badly at comparing areas, whether it's circle areas or square areas or slices of pies, okay? Think of when you were a kid, you know, I don't know whether this happened to anyone else, but, you know, so a bit of trivia. So my mum is Australian, but one of my dad's conditions before he married her was that she kind of learns how to cook Pinoy food. And she used to cook cassava cake, and it's like a round cake. And my brothers and sisters and I would argue like, oh, your piece is bigger than mine, right? Now, if we were eating something else like that, you know, if we were eating like, I don't know, churros that is like straight, like we're not going to be arguing over whose is bigger, right? So we do really badly at areas. Volumes is just ridiculously bad. We're just terrible at it. You know, like people will look at those two cubes and say, okay, that cube is like twice as big as that one, when in reality it's like 12 times bigger or something, right? So we're not good at that. So going back here, comparing this slice to this slice, we do badly at that in terms of assessing how much bigger is that slice than that slice. And then someone might say, well, we've got the labels, so it doesn't matter. And then I would say, well, if you've got the labels, you know, if it doesn't matter, then don't bother with the visualization, right? Like the whole point of the visualization is to assist in the interpretation. So use the right one for the job. Here's a makeover that Cole did of this chart. And how much easier is it to understand? Okay, she's really a virtuoso, right? So what she did, first thing she does, gray out everything. Okay, gray is a neutral color. And what graying everything out does is it pushes everything to the background. Then she uses color strategically to bring the parts that she wants you to focus on to the front. Using the Gestalt principle of similarity, I tie this insight to these two lines, and I tie this insight to that line. Okay, and then because it's a line chart, well, this is known as a slope graph. You know, I'm comparing the height of that to the height of that, and I'm doing okay as a human. So yeah, another good example there. That's a good makeover. And she's actually strategically picked out what insight she's going to talk about. You know, this didn't really change, so she's decided to leave and not talk about them. Okay. So back to our Sydney to LA chart. We're still not done with it. We need to add our narrative. This is my take. And I'd be interested if anyone has any ideas on how to improve it further. Okay, first thing I did. I added 2017. Sometimes adding the future as data points on your chart with either projections or even just leaving it blank mobilizes the executives looking at your chart to say, okay, where is it going? What's going to happen? So the original chart stopped at 2016. I've added 2017 here. And what I've done is I've done a statistical projection, seats occupied. There's various time series models you can use to make that projection. I've just done a very naive forecast where I said the year-on-year increase from Q1 2015 to Q1 2016, let's imagine that increase happens again into 2017, right? And so that's where this dotted line comes from. I've used dots to show, look, this is not real data, it's a projection into the future. So now I'm showing if the increase that happened in 2016 happens again in 2017, and then we don't add seats, this is the state of the world. This is the state of the airline in 2017. The demand wants to be at 112, but we've only got 96,000 or whatever it is. Yeah, 96,000 seats available. This is bad. Okay, we're leaving revenue on the table. So what is my takeaway? Please approve 20,000 extra seats using green to correlate it with the seats available for Q4 2017. If we don't add seats, then we're leaving revenue on the table. So that's my take on that. I'm pointing out these 2 points of intersection here as well, just to provide a little bit more insight on the chart. Just saying, hey, we reached full occupancy in the last 2 Q4s. So what do you think is going to happen in the next Q4, right? That's the implication there. Okay, so big difference between that chart and that chart. There's no story here, and it's easy for an executive to look at this and, executives are busy, right? They might not actually pull out that real story. So well-told data stories are change drivers within organizations. If you can pull out stories like this in your own data, and I've seen this happen to people that have taken our courses and applied the principles, okay? These people quickly find themselves moving up in their careers and getting close to the senior managers, because the senior people are the ones that are producing these for the C-level, right? If you can be producing these, you're going to find yourself moving up quite quickly. Okay, so that was the 4 things. It was audience, data prep, visualization selection, if visuals are appropriate, and then adding the narrative. Google data storytelling and you'll find all sorts of awesome examples of data stories that are out there. This was just a, about a 1-hour talk, 55-minute talk. If you are interested in this stuff, we have just scratched the surface in this seminar. If you're interested in a full 2-day course, we have a full 2-day course on data storytelling. Okay, it's our most popular course. I love to teach it. We're running it next week. It's sold out next week, but we have another one May 4 and 5 in Manila. If any of you will be in Singapore, 27th to 28th of Feb, it's in Singapore. We're going to run it in Silicon Valley for a couple of startups there in March 6 to 7. So yeah, that's the course. It's all on our website, all of that. The next course that we offer, the next course that we have is Introduction to Data Science and Analytics. Okay, so here's where we introduce the data science process, machine learning, and the analytics process. It's a 3-day course completely aimed at beginners. So if you're sitting there with data, you want to make predictions with it, you're not sure where to start, or you have maybe you've already done some R coding and you want to take it to the next level, this is the next course. So yeah, we're going to run that April 19 to 21. And then the third course that we have, these are different to our courses last year, by the way. The third course that we have is Predictive Analytics and Machine Learning for Business. So this is your rocket science stuff. We get into all the cool stuff, SVMs, neural nets, gradient boosting, ensembling, bagging, boosting, and doing it all in R and Azure as well. So that's our third course. Okay, but enough about that. I've got a few happy snaps of our training. So that was one of our last trainings in Manila. That was Cisco a couple of months ago. Really great group. We had a run in Sydney of data storytelling, which was kind of cool. And that's our group from Singapore. We had a few Pinoys in the Singapore run of our course as well. Okay, so yeah, that's the art and science of data storytelling in 1 hour. I hope I managed to fit a whole bunch in. Are there any questions? We've got time for questions. We've got like 15 minutes for questions. So let's have them. So opening the floor. Anyone have questions? No questions, guys? Someone must have a question. Yes. That's all right. What was that? Sorry.
Sorry.
So if we could just keep it down at the back, we're just having some questions.
I just wanted to ask who I could approach later regarding classes that I do. I'm looking for this particular topic.
Oh yeah. So we do private training, right? So yeah, we can talk to you about that. Yeah. We'll chat after. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so basically my company does analytics for HR, and HR is a really complicated field in that sense. When we present to CEOs, CHROs, most of the time